One of the things I enjoy so much about your work, Nick, is the question of where do I come from and why don't I fit in? And from what I understand, there's an origin story to Spacer's The Erebus Effect, which is, of course, the story of a woman who sees the world around her but doesn't quite understand why she doesn't fit in it in Blade Runner.
Yep.
And can you talk about that?
The classic question of Blade Runner that everybody points to that is really a classic question of all fiction that deals with artificial life. What does it mean to be human? But I think the real answer is, well, why does it matter? Because in Blade Runner, the replica, the thing that we talked about in every class I ever took where we mentioned Blade Runner, whether it was a film theory class or a sci-fi class that we were actually in together or any of those things, the conclusion that I came to every time was, well, if you simulate something so perfectly that it's basically a complete replica of the actual thing, then when does it cease to become a simulation?
It's the artificial question.
Exactly. It's the question of where does real end and artificial begin, and vice versa. That's something.
And that question powers the entire Spacer saga.
Yeah. Because one thing that I've thought of for years now, at least a couple years, is that the Spacer Saga at its heart is as much a story of the rise of artificials as it is the story of the growth and development of humankind. Because in the Spacer Saga, we know humans created artificials in the 2050s, and the relationship between the two, creator and created, that is, God and man, so to speak, and just dropped one level down. The relationship there is a fraught one, but it's also one that informs both of their existences. And I think by exploring that question of what does it mean, what does this thing that we've created mean? What does it mean for us? What do we mean for it? What do we mean for each other? And then finding out what that means down the road. That's a question that I think we're going to be asking for a long time, especially as in the real world, we continue to struggle with things like AI, which is developing all the time. I was just looking at an article tonight about how there's a scientist who predicted in 2011 that we would hit artificial general intelligence, that's real AI, like human level AI, by 2028. And he still holds to that prediction, says, we could be there within 4 or 5 years.
Oh, good. That's terrifying. So, speaking of that, and kind of the conversation of regulating AI, in the Spacer Saga, there's something called the Harrison Accords, named after Harrison Ford.
Yep, that's a fun little bit of trivia for our listeners and readers. The Harrison Accords were signed in 2299 after the Mars-Titan War, and during the Mars-Titan War, both sides used artificials in combat. They were kind of used like an implement of war, kind of like how in the First World War and the Second World War, both sides used horses, even though everybody had trucks. People still used horses. In the Mars-Titan War, the Martian Pact, the Martian Security Alliance, and the Titan Pact both used artificials to pad their forces because they were relatively low population. They had relatively low population size. So they used artificials, which could be made relatively cheaply and easily, to pad out their militaries. The problem with this is because those things are cheap and easy to make, which is what they were designed to be from the word go, so they could go where humans couldn't and do things we can't in space and other dangerous places. They make really effective and dangerous soldiers. So after this war ended, the politicians said, hey, we need to put a moratorium on this or it's just going to be a free-for-all. It's kind of like the nuclear proliferation treaties that came around in the 1950s and 60s and 70s and so on, where the United States and the Soviet Union predominantly, but also other countries signed on and said, hey, we're doing nuclear research. We don't really want to use nukes in war because that would be bad. Kind of like how they got the ICA and all its constituent parts after the Mars Titan War said, yeah, we could probably use these things in war, but if we continue to turn them against ourselves, they're just going to spread, and eventually it's going to be a bloodbath. And you're basically turning creator, you're turning master against slave, and when you arm the slave, that makes things bad for the master. To bend the analogy of artificials as slaves to its logical conclusion.
Yeah.
And they said, no, we don't want to use them in combat, so we're gonna put the kibosh on that. And over time, the Harrison Accords are amended repeatedly to basically cover more and more aspects of life, because people thought, well, wait a second, we don't want them doing service sector jobs. We don't want them doing all the service sector jobs either, because then that's taking careers away from people who need those jobs to pay for their college tuition or whatever. Whatever the case would be in the early 24th century. I slipped there, didn't I? The Harrison Accords had this sort of scope creep wherein they grew to encompass more and more restrictions on artificial life, because artificials weren't really slaves anymore, but they were basically second-class citizens. They were living within human society, but they had less rights. It's basically like Jim Crow laws.
Well, they from what I remember of Erebus, a lot of them were just sex workers.
Yeah, there's lots of sex workers. There's lots of like low. There's lots of them. There's lots of them are working in factories or in like agricultural fields.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually a story I started drafting back in the summer of 2023 when we had that fun wildfire smog. It was about people who are basically like overseeing crowds of artificials working in the fields on Mars, like in a domed over section of Mars that had agriculture. And how there was like
so the Harrison Accords evolved into the ALCA.
Yep. Well, the ALCA basically emerged from the Harrison Accords. The ALCA wasn't the first thing that the Harrison Accords created, but it was among the first. And it was the ALCA being the Artificial Life Form Control Agency. It's kind of the enforcement wing of the Harrison Accords. They realized, well, if we're going to have these accords and we're going to place these restrictions on artificial life, we need to have a department of the government that actually enforces these regulations. It's kind of like how, what would be, it's, again, we refer to nuclear proliferation treaties and nuclear non-proliferation treaties more accurately. Well, you've got things like I can't remember the acronym. There's an organization within
the START Treaty.
Well, there's that, but there's an organization within the UN that basically enforces nuclear regulations. Like they've been all over. They've been at least maybe not all over the news, but they've been all over Twitter in certain circles of Twitter the last year because there's nuclear reactors in Ukraine, and I think it's like the IACA or something like that. So it's International Atomic Commission Agency or something like that. And they basically go in these really up-armored like Toyotas, and they inspect reactors in war-torn places, for example, places like Eastern Ukraine, and make sure they don't melt down and create Chernobyl events.
That would be nice, yes.
Yeah. And that's kind of what the ALCA is, but for the Harrison Accords. They're basically making sure the Harrison Accords are followed, and they're followed to the letter of the law.
And in Spacer's The Erebus Effect, the main character, Janet Harkov, has been basically a cop for many years, but a cop that only polices robots.
Yeah. She at the time of Spacer's The Erebus Effect, which takes place in late 2354, she has been a tracer, or at least a ALCA agent, for about 8 years. She started the academy in 2346, and she's been in the agency for about 8 years. And most of that time, she's been what's called a tracer, which is considered the most dangerous and, of course, therefore most glamorous job in the agency, because that's basically, it's kind of like how the ATF has guys who actually break down doors and like take the guns away from people like the Branch Davidians, or people like that. That's kind of what tracers are. They're the people who go out and actually, when there's like artificials that break the rules, they're the guys who who arm up and then go out and chase them down, or go out and investigate where they are.
because there's 7 divisions to the ACLA, and divisions 1 through 6 interface with the civilian populace. Like there's a scene in Erebus where there is a woman that works at a diner who is an artificial woman, and like the guy who owns the diner is kind of a jerk to her, and then Janet says something like, well, if your papers are in order, you're fine.
Exactly.
So, but people from divisions 1 through 6 would interface with her almost kind of like immigration's custom enforcement in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And like the ALCA divisions 1 through 6 would interface with her employer and with her and make sure she's like, staying on like curfew, whatever. Division 7 is where Janet's at. And that's the start of the book, is a series of rogue AIs. And she's pulling at the yarn of a sweater, and as she keeps pulling, the sweater is unraveling. The sweater being an analogy for society.
Yeah.
And so
that's one thing that's one of the major defining qualities of Janet's personality, is that she doesn't know when to let it go.
Yeah.
Because that's ironically enough, that's one thing she shares in common with her ex-husband. They both don't know when to let it go, which is probably why they're no longer married. Or a big part of the reason why they're no longer married. But I digress. But basically, they continue to pull at the threads until the whole thing comes toppling down around them. And that's kind of what happens with her.
So we've got the artificial question we're asking. We've got the ACLA. We got the Harrison Accords. So Simultech is the one that makes most of the robots, right?
Yes, Simultech is the one that makes most of the artificials. They were originally a division of a company that started off doing a little bit of everything, that was broken up in the late 21st century. And then all of the subdivisions that were broken off of that huge mega corporation ended up becoming huge mega corporations themselves, one of which is Simultech, which is headquartered on Mars. And they basically make artificials. They produce artificials in factories, like subterranean factories, that are then deployed all over the solar system to do menial work. Because the thing about artificials that I think needs to be made clear is that they are a lot like the replicants from Blade Runner. And of course, this is kind of insinuated in the first movie, and it's made more clear in Blade Runner 2049, the sequel, is that replicants aren't made, basically, they're grown. They're basically they're more like clones, if anything, than they are like robots. Because a robot, you can build the parts on an assembly line and then assemble them possibly on the same assembly line or elsewhere. A replicant replicants and artificials are basically grown in test tubes, essentially, and then compiled in like vats. And then they're sort of spat out almost like a full grown, like basically being born fully grown. And then, they're at least within the lore, they're usually given about 4 years to develop, maybe less, depending on what role is they're expected to fill, what the need is at the time. They're given 3 or 4 years to develop, and then they're pushed out into the world as a fully realized worker. So they sort of have a crash course on being a human, because obviously a real human, you technically have you have around 18 years to become a fully realized adult. An artificial has 3 or 4. And the only reason that there's 3 or 4 is because you have to take some time, sort of like the Blade Runner movies insinuate. You have to take some time to develop the personality and the memories and the skills to actually be a person, even if you're like born fully grown. Because otherwise you won't be fully functional. You'll be sort of like you'll be in a child's like state.
Something I like about that you wrote about the relationship between the ALCA and Simultech is how it's kind of like the relationship between the ATF and the NRA.
Yeah, exactly.
Where the true believers on the ground hate each other, and they see each other as the enemy. They see each other as the thing that is most detrimental to society writ large. The people up top all go to the same country clubs. Their kids go to school together. They vacation together. They get each other jobs. They cross-pollinate across both organizations. Because once you finish your civil service job, then you get your nice lobbying position with, Simultech.
Yeah.
because Simultech will pull people from the ALCA because they say, "Oh, you already know everybody, so you know who to talk to." And
Hmm.
I thought that was a brilliant piece of writing on your part, sir.
Yep. Thank you. So by having that corruption in government and business, we're able to sort of shine a light on the fact that that's how it is in the world. That's how it is with organizations that do, on the one hand, one organization regulates something, or at least in theory, the other organization promotes its use, or at least in theory. And then sometimes they are basically one and the same when you get to the top levels, because money talks. Money is what people are chasing. They're not chasing ideals or perfection. They're chasing the almighty dollar.
So the artificials, from their 3 centuries of development, from the 2050s all the way to Spacers, the Erebus effect,
Mm-hmm.
have created their own sort of Creole underground culture, which is a hodgepodge of human cultures. And it was, you know, built to give them an identity outside of being slaves. It was at it, and because so many cultures of people that are on the bottom of a society, they need something to hang their hat on. They need a self-identifying cultural marker to anchor themselves into reality, to where they can just say, this is ours and this is mine. I have nothing else, but I have this.
Exactly.
Even if it's just, like a pure fantasy or pure artifice or whatever.
In this case, it really is artifice. Because in the case of the Zarns, this is something we actually talked about when we were sort of hashing out the ideas for this episode. I actually sort of stole this idea from one of your favorite works of fiction, which is the Battlestar Galactica reboot, where one of the few things that I actually know about that series, and yes, I'm outing myself as someone who hasn't seen it, in spite of all the things that I would probably love about it. One of the few things that I do actually know about it is there's a bit in there where one of the Cylons, or one of the human Cylons or whatever, says basically, we will never be out of your shadow until you are gone, or something to that effect. Thing about living in the shadow of humans is we can only ever be compared to the humans by destroying humanity and moving away, or both. We're able to they'd be able to form their own society. That's something a lot of Zarns feel, especially some of the more revolutionary ones, because they were created. You talk about lack of identity in the Black American community, where you have people who are stolen away from their culture and taken thousands of miles away, and then had their culture ritualistically, or at least intensely smashed out of them through years of oppression and abuse. The problem with the Zarns, they had all of that, plus the fact they were literally created in a lab in the 2050s and created from scratch, and they weren't given a culture. They basically said, "Hey, you're going to be our workers." It's like, okay, well, we also have emotion. We also have the ability to feel feelings and fear and hope and pain and desire. So they're of course going to develop their own sort of hodgepodge Creole culture over time. And the only way they really know how to do that is by cribbing things here and there from humans. Like, hey, we like this little bit of music, or we like this little bit of language. We're gonna snag all these things. The actual Zarin language. But another little bit of trivia for our fans is that the Zarin language actually comes from the only other possibly artificial beings they have ever known, which are the precursors, which are the beings that created the Ramayana artifacts, which are beneath Titan. That's a whole other story that we'll get to someday. But basically, all we need to know for now is that these artifacts are on the order of 500 million years old, and the Zarns believe they were created by artificial beings who inhabited the solar system long before humans. And as a result, some of them all kind of revere these beings, and they sort of
I was
not
gonna say
stole, but sort of paid homage to them by taking some of their culture and saying, "Hey, we're going to make this ours."
that should be a religion for them.
Yeah,
That should be the Zarn religion as the precursors.
yeah,
That's such a simple that's such a slam dunk where you've got like we're a lost oppressed people. I'm a Zarn. We're a lost repressed people. We're artificials. Billions of years ago, the ones that made everybody in the solar system were actually like us. So we're
Exactly.
actually the prophesized chosen ones that were sent by the precursors who knew we were coming to lead the artificial revolution and take back the solar system, which is kind of how Erebus goes a little bit, if you think about it,
Yeah.
where because the whole book is about Janet Harkoff racing against time to stop the artificial revolution.
Exactly. And that's actually something that I've had the idea for a while now. Is that it's basically the religion. It's not a religion in the same way that maybe human religions are, at least not all of them. But it certainly has flavor. It certainly has a flavor of it,
Oh
if you
yeah.
will, and that
Oh yeah.
there's reverence, there's faith, there's
No
they
one believes more. No one believes harder than only not oppressed people, poor people, people with nothing, people with terrible lives. They're the ones with the strongest faith.
yep.
And so and granted, yeah, Battlestar was like this. Battlestar, their robots believed in the one true God. Like they believed hard, so hard they genocided all of the humans, or all but like 50,000 of the humans. But I think I would do that, and we will develop that idea more as we go, of
Mhm.
course. So I'm not saying we have to do that right now, but um, yeah, yeah, no one, no, because otherwise, what's the point? There's this, and not only this question of who am I that kind of fuels the Spacer saga. The follow up is what's the point?
Mhm.
And I think for artificials, a religion to where they're the prophesized chosen ones that are sent to take back the solar system. Oh my gosh, what meaning, what significance that would give them. And on that note, sir, we'll end it for today for the Blanket Fortress of Solitude. I am Derwin,
And I am Nick.
and we will see you next time.
Chapter 1 New Galley, Mars, 2354. The night was cold and dark. Desert dust mingled with the air, forcing its way into your clothes and clinging to your hair, coating your skin, drowning your soul. The soul of Mars ran red with the blood of innocence, and on a night like tonight, there were always folks willing to spill a little more. Special Agent Janet Harkoff strode out of the night, scanning the street. She had close-cropped hair the color of sand and wore a stark frown that betrayed her impatience for bullshit. After taking in the scenery, her dark, taciturn eyes settled on a building to her right on the south side of the street. It bore a faded neon sign proclaiming antiques hanging over the door, which was turned off. Janet reached out and rang the doorbell. A muffled buzzing came from the inside. Following a long pause, the door creaked open. A weathered face appeared in the sliver of darkness, twisted into a scowl. "Can't you see we're closed?" the man said, nodding toward the dimmed open sign. As he swung the door shut, Janet caught it with her right hand and said, "I'm going to have to insist." The man's scowl returned. "Look, if you're going to cause a scene, then I'm going to have to call the..." Janet deftly withdrew her ID wallet with her free hand and flipped it open. It displayed a silver shield and the stylized letters ALCA, along with her agent's credentials. The name Harkoff, Janet E. stood out in a well-defined black letters next to the stern-faced ID photo. "Don't bother," she said, in a voice like polished granite. "Someone went to the trouble already. That's why I'm here. This is an official ALCA investigation." Ignoring the man's sputtering, she forced the door open and pushed in past him, returning her credentials deftly to her pocket as she did. She looked around, taking in the interior of the store. The tables were weighed down with cellular phones, dusty circuit board computers, and video disc players, most centuries old. She grinned as she took in the scenery, telling him this sure is a nice setup you've got here. She picked up a wind up toy monkey off a display table, having only seen one before in vintage movies. She was half tempted to wind up the little piece of history and just see it clang away. But instead, she continued, telling the old man the anonymous tip we received told us you might be trafficking livelier trinkets than this. She placed the monkey down and turned to face him, neatly crossing her arms, her eyes boring into his, telling him the artificial kind, that is. The old man licked his lips. Unable to keep her gaze for long, he smiled, showing several crooked teeth. The expression was clearly forced. He couldn't even bring himself to deny it. Janet smiled faintly, understanding. She turned on her heel, scanning the room in a businesslike manner. She spotted a door along the back wall of the main room with a faded employees only sign tacked onto it. She stepped toward the door. I'll just look around for myself then. I'm sure you won't mind. As she neared the door, the old man rushed to intercept her. He had found his confidence again. No, I'm afraid that is out of the question. I'm sorry you came all this way here for nothing. He put a commanding hand on her shoulder, telling her, I'll show you the door. Janet turned her head and disdainfully looked at his hand. The look on her face would have told a wiser man what kind of danger he was in. Then her placid smile returned. I think I'll stay here, thanks. She opened the back room door and stepped through. She paid no mind to the old man's protest, finding herself awash in a dizzying array of old tech knickknacks, layer upon layer in baskets that were stacked on shelves, almost scraping the 3-meter ceiling. She strode down the center aisle and rounded a corner, her right hand instinctively reaching for the left side of her jacket. The old man kept pace behind her. He was shouting now. Now listen here. This is my establishment, and I have a right to privacy. You have yet to produce a warrant, and I will not allow. Janet wheeled on him, one finger raised, dangerously. As a matter of fact, you have no such rights. Article 18, subsections 4 through 9 of the Harrison Accord state that I can search the premises for contraband of the artificial sort without any need of a warrant or prior alert of said search. That means if you get in my way, your right to privacy isn't the only right you'll be forfeiting tonight. As she spoke, someone came around the corner. A tall, athletic man who looked to be about 20, wearing pristine blue coveralls and carrying a bundle of spare parts. He had dark hair and tanned olive skin. The stranger said nothing, staring at Janet with widened eyes that broadcasted intense, uneasy tension. The old man stepped up next to Janet and continued his protest. Yes, he is my assistant, he sputtered, putting himself between Janet and the other man. He's been here almost a year now. Janet shot a glance at the old man and then turned to the stranger again and put her hand on her hip. So what's the story? She pointed to the coveralls with her other hand. Those are pretty clean for someone who's been working in an antique electronics shop for a year. He said nothing, still glaring at her. She stared straight back, slowly moving her hand towards the holster. Show me your wrist, pal. And then, quicker than Janet could whip out her pistol, he exploded to life. He threw the bundle of spare parts at Janet and then charged her, almost bowling her over as he made for the rear exit. Stop! The old man shouted as the runner reached the door. They'll kill you if you run! Janet shoved him aside, pistol drawn. She practically leapt out of the rear door and down the stoop after him, only to find the suspect had vanished. Shit! She yelled. Then she pressed a button on her wrist-mounted data device. Zero, are you there? I'm at the back exit of the old antique shop. Get the local MarSec precinct on the line. There's an old man inside who is sheltering the suspect. Have the local operatives book him when they arrive. I'm going after the goddamn Zarky. Do you have a visual on where it's headed? Not waiting for a response, Janet took off down the rear of the storefront, then rounded the corner into an alley leading back to the main street. She scanned for movement, then took off again. When she reached the street, it was more crowded than before. Late night revelers were gathering, wandering about the streets in search of one more drink before last call. Soon the Union Day celebrations would be starting. Zero's voice returned a moment later. Harkov, I got it. It's headed south, down the street, just ahead of you. Janet swiveled, craning her neck for the sign of her target. Its dark coveralls were like a spotlight against the bright outfits of the civvies. Janet pursued, the skyline looming ahead of her like dark glittering mountains. Reaching the crowd of revelers, she waved her badge over her head. Get out of the way, she shouted. ALCA, let me through. The dumbfounded people parted like pages of a book, allowing her enough space to continue forward. A sloppy drunk in a tattered Dayglow smoking jacket grabbed her ass as she pressed past him and got a broken hand in return. She pressed through more crowds of people, her eyes still straining to catch a glimpse of the running man in blue coveralls. There. She saw her target ducking through a crowd further down the street. Shoving through a cluster of civilians, Janet tore off again after her quarry. This was where she was in her element, hunting hostiles, just like the old days. Just like Titan, she thought, grinning. A crackly voice sounded in the bud in her left ear. Harkov, I've got your location. Bad guys on the next street over. She pressed 2 fingers of her left hand to the side of her neck, activating the subdermal microphone located there. I'm going to try to force the thing into a corner. See if you can find me a dead end somewhere. After a breath, she went on. It's already bolted once. I'm legal to retire on sight. With that, she burst ahead at full tilt, almost knocking down an old man with a much younger woman on his arm, both of whom barely just got out of her way as she barreled past. The street ahead reached a 4-way junction with an antique wrought iron fountain near the center. A going-away party outside the fountain had merged with 3 bachelor parties. All 4 groups had conglomerated into a raucous tornado of self-destruction. Janet didn't concern herself with any of this. All she cared about was the cover the crowd provided for an artificial on the run, already all but indistinguishable from the humans around it. It was further ahead now, and rapidly gaining distance. Now it was time for desperate measures. She pointed her weapon up at the sky. Everyone get down, she shouted, and then she squeezed the trigger. Dozens of people reflexively ducked or threw themselves to the ground at the sound of the shot. As it echoed off the buildings throughout the square, she clearly saw her target. It was the only one in sight who failed to duck at the sound of the gunshot. It was now turning down one of the side streets, heading directly for a blind alley. Janet leapt down the pedestal and took off again. She activated the subdermal mic. Zero, get the local precinct down here. Tell them to be ready for crowd control. And tell the agency to bring a tag and bag team for when I'm done with this piece of shit. In her ear, Zero's voice crackled. I thought you were going to take this one alive. Janet ignored him. She had made up her mind. The ones that caused trouble could spread funny ideas. For Janet's money, it was better to cut off the head of the snake before it got too big to wrangle. Up ahead, Janet could see the Zarn reach the dead end. It didn't miss a beat. Turning on its heel and aiming to take off past her before she made up her mind to shoot. That's why you never give them a chance, Janet thought bitterly. She'd seen it gone wrong so many times. She wasn't about to make that mistake again. Luckily, the wayward Zorn had taken a wrong turn down a dead end. Janet caught up to her target and came to a quick halt a half-dozen paces away. She raised her pistol and aimed it at the artificial, now swiveling its head in search of an escape. End of the line, she said firmly. Put your hands on your head and get on your knees now. She tightened her grip on the weapon. It had run, which meant she was within her rights to kill it. All she needed, all she wanted, was a reason. All she had to do was wait.